be turning to Revelation chapter 8. Revelation chapter 8. That's where we're going to be picking up here in just a moment. This evening, Revelation chapter 8. I will quickly do a review or quickly go through our outline that we're following, and then I'll spend just a moment reviewing, sort of catching us up to where we are as we enter chapter 8 here tonight. The main theme of the book of Revelation, as we've been mentioning, we want to keep reminding ourselves of as we discuss the book, is that its ultimate point is about victory in the Lamb. The key verse is chapter 17 and in verse 14. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. That's the main point that is being driven home throughout this book of Revelation. Is in spite of everything going on, in spite of all the persecution those that John is writing to are facing, remember that Christ or the Lamb is the one that is victorious. Now, we've outlined the book into two sections. The first of those is the conflict on earth in 1 through 11, and the second is the conflict between the Lamb and the dragon in 12 through 22. So again, right now we're dealing with the conflict on earth and what's going to happen. And we get a sort of a foreshadowing, I think, of the fall of Rome in this study. But then 12 through 22, where we see that Babylon the Great, or Rome, as it represents fall, the reason for that conflict is because ultimately, starting in chapter 12, there's a conflict between the Lamb and between the dragon. We also want to remind ourselves quickly of our rules that we've been giving as we're studying in the book of Revelation. We want to remind ourselves that the book was written largely to encourage the people of John's day, that it is largely symbolic, that it heavily used Old Testament terminology, not to press the details of the symbolism, to interpret the book in light of clear biblical passages, and to visualize or picture the visions in your mind, almost like you were seeing it as a movie unfold in your head, much like John would have seen it unfolding. As we're getting ready now for chapter 8, again, we're going back real quick on some of these rules, remembering it's largely written for the people of John's day, that it is symbolic and not to press the details. Again, when we're getting into these more difficult sections of Revelation, there are a couple of different viewpoints that are held concerning some of them. And so you read from one commentator and they say, I think this represents this. And another commentator, I'm talking about among conservative commentators, another one says, I think it represents this. And you come to the end of the chapter, as we said, their end point is the same. And so we don't want to spend forever pressing the details of the symbolism. We're trying to get the picture of the message that John is conveying to those that he is writing to. We're ready for chapter 8 now. Chapter 8, we're going to title The Seventh Seal and the First Four Trumpets. The key verse is verse 1, and I'll come to that verse more in a moment. But let's again set the background. Let's go back to chapter 4 first. Chapter 4 is the throne scene, and it begins a shift in the book of Revelation. Chapter 1, 2, and 3 were an introduction, where chapter 1 introduced the book being symbolic. Chapter 1 spent some time introducing Christ, who's walking among the lampstands. And then 2 and 3, he's there writing to these or conveying a message to these 7 churches. When we come then into chapter 4, though, really 4 through 11, we're focused on the same thing. And we group it together for simplicity's sake in our outline. But 4 through 11 is really where we're focused very heavily on this conflict on earth. Through chapter 4 is the throne scene. John sees the throne, the one who is on the throne, and the point we get from chapter 4 is that God is the one on the throne and he's the one in control. Chapter 5 then, we're introduced to the Lamb. But before we get to the Lamb, we see that the one on the throne has a scroll in his right hand. That scroll is written on the front and the back, meaning the message is complete, and sealed with 7 seals. It's tamper-proof. What is written is going to happen. The question in chapter 5 is, who's worthy to open the scroll, to take the scroll from the one on the throne and open it? And originally the answer is what? The original answer is nobody. But then the Lion of Judah, the Lamb, is able to go and take the scroll, chapter 5. That's the end of the scroll for chapter 5, as the rest of it is about praising the Lamb for being worthy. Chapter 6, then, we began with the seals. So remember, there are 7 seals. In chapter 6, we began with 6 of those 7 seals being open. So the first seal was open, and there was the white horse, chapter 6, the triumph of the gospel. The second seal, the red horse, the carnage that follows the persecution that follows the gospel. The black horse, the economic hardships, I think that is, that results from the following the gospel. The fourth, the pale horse, which represents death, and it can just sort of mean, as Waldron and Harkrider point out, it seems to mean the infirmities of life on top of the persecution that those that are Christians are worrying about, the same infirmities that others are. The fifth seal is the souls under the altar crying out, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" The sixth seal then is judgment. Now, that's really where we're focusing the rest of our time. When we get to the seventh seal, there's judgment coming on Rome. We'll introduce more to them later in the book. Again, we're going from Rome based off our date. If somebody takes the early date, Jerusalem. But the judgment is coming on Rome. Chapter 7, then, that we covered on Sunday morning, we said is an interlude. If you were to take chapter 7 out, read the end of chapter 6, and pick up at the start of chapter 8, you wouldn't think you'd missed anything if you didn't have the numbers next to the chapters. In terms of 7 is an interlude, answering the question at the end of chapter 6, who's able to stand against the wrath of God? The answer is those that are sealed by God. They don't have to worry about that punishment. That's what chapter 7 is about. The 144,000 we talked about on Sunday morning. Chapter 8 now brings us back to the seals, and chapter 8 opens up in verse 1, the key verse. When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. So this chapter 8 now leads to the opening of the seventh seal. Now, we're going to jump ahead of ourselves for just a second. What's in that seventh seal? Well, there are 7 angels given 7 trumpets. So now we have these 7 trumpets that are going to be sounded. The rest of chapter 8 is a prelude to those, an introduction to the trumpets in 1 to 6, and then the first 4 trumpets. So again, there's 7 trumpets, just like there's 7 seals. We're introduced to the first 4 trumpets here in chapter 8. Chapter 9, on Sunday morning, is the 5th and the 6th trumpet. Chapter 7, then, is the angel in the little book. Chapter 11 introduces the 2 witnesses, and then at the end of chapter 11, we come back and get the 7th and final trumpet. So we're introduced to those trumpets here in chapter 8. We're not going to be done with those 7 trumpets until the end of chapter 11. Now remember, chapter 11 closes the first half of the book. Not just by chapters, there's 22 chapters, but not just by chapters, by our outline. The conflict on earth closes at the end of 11. 12 to 22, then, it's in 12 we're going to start talking about the dragon and the conflict between the Lamb and the dragon. So until we finish this section in chapter 11, we're not done with the trumpets after chapter 8, or even after chapter 9. Chapter 10, half of 11, is, again, an interlude between the 6th and 7th trumpets. So, let's go now to chapter 8. We've set some background information, and again, we've jumped ahead a little bit, but we're going to come to those trumpets at the very end of this section of the book in chapter 11. But we are introduced to those here in chapter 8. Verse 1 beginning. When he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. At this point, let's stop there. What is in the 7th seal? Forget what I told you a minute ago is that in the 7th seal. At this point, when the seal is open in verse 1, what do we see in the seal? We don't see anything. The seal is opened, and now there is silence for about half an hour. Now, you read through commentaries, there's sort of 2 main views as to what this silence for half an hour could mean. One view is it could represent a delay in judgment. And that is, God is conveying the message to John in this vision, and John to his audience. God is coming in judgment, but that judgment's not going to be right this moment. Now, it's going to shortly take place. Chapter 1, we saw that. Chapter 4, things that are shortly going to take place. Even the end of the book that are shortly going to take place. But while it's going to be shortly, it's not right this very moment. And so the silence for half an hour could represent a delay in judgment. God's coming on Rome, but he's not coming this exact moment. The second viewpoint is that perhaps the pause is for dramatic effect. It says, you know what? You think about somebody, they may, if you watch a speech, somebody may take a pause in a speech to give people sort of time to think about what was said and then resume. It's for dramatic effect. Haley said, a half an hour is ordinarily a short period of time, but it seems long when one is waiting. The impressive pause focuses attention on heaven's interest as all wait in breathless suspense and expectation for what is to follow. And so you sort of see this dramatic effect. There's a pause, and now you're thinking, I wonder what's going to be next. And so everybody's attention is sort of drawn to that. Some suggest perhaps there could be a combination of the two. There's a delay in judgment, but also it brings your attention, there being silence, that whatever's in this seal, everybody's just sort of waiting in anticipation for. So there's something in this seventh seal, and we'll get to what it is in a minute, but there's something in the seventh seal, again, conveying judgment, but there's a pause there, again, perhaps for dramatic effect, perhaps to represent a delay in judgment. Again, it could even be a combination of the two, drawing attention to what's going to come. Well, now verse 2. There's a pause for half an hour. There's silence for half an hour. Now let's get to verse 2. We're going to start finding out what's in this seventh seal. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God to learn, or to them were given seven trumpets. I guess to illustrate this point, anybody remember playing with ever having the Russian nesting dolls? You open one up and then there's another doll inside. You open it up and there's another one inside. You open it up and there's another. That's almost what John's vision's like. There's these seventh seals. When are we going to get to the seventh seal? We get to the seventh seal. Now there's seven trumpets, and we got to get to the end of the seven trumpets to find out what that message is about. So the farther we're getting into the book, the more we're unlocking, but the more there is still yet to see in this vision, as there's now seven trumpets. And as we'll see in a minute, something comes with those trumpets. When they sound, something follows. But before we get to the seven trumpets, it says the angels who stood before God were given seven trumpets. Now, when you think about a trumpet and what a trumpet represents, a trumpet was used in the scriptures for a number of purposes. Sometimes a trumpet was used to call together a group, such as Numbers 10, 1 through 9. Sometimes it was used to warn in Ezekiel 33:3, one of the watchman passages. When he sees the sword coming up on the land, if he blows the trumpet and warns the people. Sometimes it's used to sound an alarm. Hosea 5:8, blow the ram's horn in Gibeah, the trumpet in Ramah, cry aloud at Bethaven, look behind you, O Benjamin. It's to sound an alarm for something. Sometimes it was used to call, as an alarms and calls the assembly. It's used that way in Joel 2:1 and again in verse 15. So when you think about, again, Revelation uses Old Testament terminology. You hear trumpet, oh, I know what a trumpet is. But think about how trumpets were used under the Old Testament, and it's issuing a warning about something. And so there's a warning now. What's that warning? What's coming? Judgment on Rome is coming. And as the trumpets begin to sound here in this chapter, we see that judgment starting to take place. So there's a warning here. The seven angels have seven trumpets. It's issuing a warning here as they're given these trumpets. But then in verse 3, there's an eighth angel. So there's the seven angels that have the seven trumpets. Then in verse 3, then another angel having a golden censer came and stood at the altar. So now we have an eighth angel. So there's the seven with the trumpets. Now here's another angel not one of the seven, a different one, another one, who came having a golden censer, and he came and stood at the altar, and he was given much incense that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the altar. I want to draw our attention back to earlier in the book, where earlier in the book we are told about those in chapter 5, verse 8. There were the 4 living creatures, and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each having a harp and a golden bowl full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. So there's this golden bowl of incense, that's the prayers of the saints, and then the angel here in chapter 8 is given incense to offer with the prayers of the saints upon the golden altar before the throne. So, again, taking that incense and the prayers of the saints are going up where? To God. They're going before God. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints ascended before God from the angel's hand. So again, there it is ascending. Our prayers go before God. Look now at verse 8. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there were noises, earthquakes, lightnings, and an earthquake. Now I want you to think about, now, I know when you go back to chapter 6, we're dealing with those that have already been martyrs for the cause of Christ. But what was one of the cries taking place by those under the altar? How long? How long are you going to allow, and again, I'm paraphrasing this, but how long are you going to allow our enemy to oppress us for trying to serve you? Perhaps some of those John may be writing to, may have prayed a prayer somewhat similar to Jesus in the garden. You know what? That the Lord would take this out of the way, that the persecution would cease. If not, let us, stand firm. I think of Jesus' prayer, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. If there's persecution, let us stand firm. But if possible, let that persecution cease. And so here, these prayers are going up, and if you're one of those John's writing to, and the persecution seems to be getting worse and worse and worse, you may think that what? God's not listening to your prayers. And what John's conveying here, when you take chapter 5, and what's being conveyed in the vision here in chapter 8, those prayers have made it up before God. God has heard the prayers. And I think verse 5, God now in verse 5 is responding to those prayers. The incense and the prayers are in that censer there, and it's taken and it is offered to God, and then the fire from that is put in the censer and dumped out on the earth, and there are noises and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. Those are all terms, again, used to refer to God's judgment. And so I think what verse 5 is saying is, here they're praying before God, and guess what? God has heard them, and God is going to answer. When? Well, it seems delayed. I think again, verse 1, there's silence for half an hour. Verse 6 now. So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. So there's preparation. Again, that verse, particularly verse 2 and 6, is sort of a prelude. Talked about an interlude, right? In the middle, sort of a pause from it. We sort of have a prelude leading us in from the opening of the 7th seal to the sounding of the trumpets. They're standing there. They prepared themselves to sound. They're waiting. They just need to get the go-ahead to sound the trumpet, and then they'll sound it. We'll start hearing those now in verse 7. But before we go to verse 7, and start talking about what these trumpets mean, I want you to notice something that appears several times in the text. Look at verse 7. And a third of the trees. Skip down to verse 8. And a third of the sea. Look at verse 9. And a third of the ships. Verse 10. And it fell on a third of the rivers. Verse 11. A third of the waters. Verse 12. And a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the stars, so that a third of them were darkened, a third of the day did not shine. So we keep hearing this phrase again and again, a third, a third, a third. There are really 2 viewpoints. One viewpoint is that this is judgment starting to happen upon Rome, but that judgment's not yet complete, not till we get later in the book. That's true. I think the likelier suggestion here is it's a third is showing us there is destruction coming. This is not a total destruction, though. This isn't final judgment. This is a partial, or only a portion is destroyed. So this does not represent final judgment, but the judgment on a certain people or certain nation, being in this case, Rome. I think that's what the third represents. It's not final judgment. It's not even the last opportunity for some to come to God. Judgment's coming, but it's coming upon a nation. So this is not what he's talking about in 7 through the end of the chapter here is not the final judgment. In fact, we don't get to that until the end of the book. But this is judgment upon the people of Rome. Go to verse 7 now again. The first angel sounded. So we got the first trumpet sounding. The first angel sounded, and hell and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Now, I think Summers suggests that what these 4 trumpets in particular are focusing on is the sort of some of the calamities that followed in Rome. And so if you take history, there were some natural disasters that came and played a part in the downfall of Rome. Then you've got the economic collapse of Rome, the ships being destroyed, and that could represent economic collapse. Then you've got an invading people. And so the suggestion is that that's sort of part about the natural disasters and things that led to the crippling of Rome. But I think if you take all of these into account in verse 7, I want you to notice some of the terms that he uses. He says that hail and fire are used, that mixed with blood, are mingled with blood, are coming down from heaven. Hail and fire are spoken of in the Old Testament as God's weapon arsenal for the day of battle. Go to Job 38. Time will not permit us to go through all of Job 38. Really, you can read through the end of the chapter there in Job 38, beginning at verse 22, but there's 41 verses. Time will not permit us, but let's just start in verse 22. Have you entered the treasury of snow, or have you seen the treasury of hell, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? By what way is light diffused, or the east wind scattered over the earth? Who's divided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt? To cause it to rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness in which there is no man, to satisfy the desolate waste and cause to spring forth the growth of tender grass. And so, again, we're not going to go through all of Job. You can read through all of that later on. But this term is used, or this terminology is used at times in the Old Testament to refer to God's weapon arsenal for the day of battle. In Job, there's the treasury of hell, and then he talks about coming for the day of trouble. It is used of destroying enemies in Isaiah 30. The Lord will cause his glorious voice to be heard and show the descent of his arm with the indignation of his anger and the flame of a devouring fire with scattering tempest and hailstones. And so at times it is used, like in Isaiah 30, as an instrument of destruction of enemies. It is an instrument of judgment against those that are rebellious. Exodus chapter 9, one of the 10 plagues was the plague of hail came down. Isaiah 28:2, behold, the Lord has a mighty and strong one, like a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, like a flood of mighty waters overflowing, who will bring them down to the earth with his hand. It is used in Isaiah 28:17 as judgment against falsehood of idolaters. Also, I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plummet. The hell will sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters will overflow the hiding place. So again, when we take all of its use of hell and fire as it's used in the Old Testament, it is representative of God coming in what? Some sense of destruction and whether it's destroying enemies, whether it's stamping out rebellion, whether it's just trying to destroy idolatry. It is used throughout the Old Testament to show and represent that God is coming in judgment. So again, maybe it is representing, when it talks about the trees being burned up and the grass is burned up, that it is talking about perhaps some natural calamities that came, and God using those, because God can use those. He's the one in control. But the point ultimately to understand is this: regardless of exactly what it means of it coming down on the plants, the hail and the fire mingled with blood is saying God is going to bring judgment. Where? On a third. What does that mean? It's not final. This is not the final judgment. This is a judgment again on a people or a nation, the Empire of Rome, not the final judgment. Go to verse 8 now. The second angel sounded. Now we have the second trumpet. And something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. And so, we now have a destruction of mountains taking place. The mountains are on fire, and they're thrown into the sea. Now again, I think it some suggest that the sea and the ships being destroyed could represent the economic collapse of the people of Rome, and perhaps that may be that did, from a historical standpoint, the economic collapse of Rome did play a part in their ultimate downfall. But I want you to think about this. That should be the destruction of the mountains. Think about how mountains are used in the Old Testament. Again, where are we pulling our terminology from? We're going back to the Old Testament because that's where John's referring to. Now, John's not saying, hey, you remember what Isaiah said over in Isaiah 41? Remember what, it's not like even in the book of Matthew, as was spoken by the prophet. He's not directly quoting most of his passages, but he's alluding to some things. Well, listen to Isaiah 1. Isaiah 41:15. Behold, I will make you into a new threshing sledge with sharp teeth, and shall thresh the mountains and beat them small, and make the hills like chaff. Chapter 64 now, verse 1. Oh, that you would rend the heavens, that you would come down, that the mountains might shake at your presence. Amos 4:1. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on the mountain of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to your husbands, bring wine, let us drink. And so when you take the mountains, how they're used in the Old Testament, and you can go through, and again, we're just looking at a verse. Time would not permit us to trace the exact chapter through. But as you go back to these usages in the Old Testament, mountains at times were used to represent the heathen powers. So the mountain in this case, what's happened to the mountain in Revelation? It's on fire, and then it's taken and what? Thrown into the sea. So if the mountain represents heathen powers, what's going to happen to those heathen powers? They're going to be destroyed, right? Overthrown. They're getting those heathen powers are taken out of the way. So this likely represents the upheaval of the foreign governments. Again, in this case, the upheaval of the Roman government. As it's used in other passages in the prophets, it's the judgment on the nations section. But in this case, we're talking specifically about Rome. Now, I think Haley suggests that the sea, and you can trace through in his commentary, you'll go to chapter 13 to trace this through, that the sea at times is represented as the mass of humanity. And so that government putting itself over the people is just taken and tossed out of the way and destroyed. Something, by the way, that a lot of people are going to be relying on, because Rome was the world empire. And it's going to cause some, and I think we'll see this in a minute, some bitterness on the people under Rome when they see the downfall of Rome. The Christians are going to be happy, but the other people that feel like life is going well may not be satisfied and feel that it's a bitter thing. They are destroyed. Go to verse 10 now. Then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and of the springs. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. Now, we talked about this in chapter 6. So if you go back to chapter 6, what does a star often represent in the apocalyptic literature? It is often used of foreign rulers. You remember in Isaiah 14, Isaiah 14, people often go to Isaiah 14 and talk about Lucifer, and many people think that it's referring to who? Satan, right? That Satan is who's being talked about, and you can go through and trace it. That's not at all who's being discussed in Isaiah chapter 14. In fact, what he's discussing is their enemy. He's actually discussing the downfall of those in Babylon. So Lucifer in Isaiah 14 is not representative of Satan, but rather a representative of the king of Babylon. And that's what he's been discussing leading up to that. And in fact, if you have headings in your Bibles, the heading in mine has the fall of the king of Babylon, 3 to 11, then the fall of Lucifer, 12 through 21, and then Babylon's destroyed, 22 and 23. That's all together. It's one section. He doesn't stop and deal with Satan and come back to Babylon. He's talking about the king of Babylon. Here's how he describes him. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nation. So he describes it a fall from heaven. You know what Lucifer means, by the way? You have a footnote, literally means day star. Mark 13:25, the stars of heaven will fall and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Again, talking of judgment. And so this idea of the star falling is used at the downfall of nations. Now the star is called what? Wormwood. The star then fell on the waters, and the waters became wormwood, which is this bitter plant. And so what he's saying is that wormwood, the star is falling, and it's called wormwood because of its bitterness. It falls onto the waters, the fresh waters in this case, the rivers and stuff, and it falls on those. They become, a third of them, so again, not final judgment, becomes bitter like wormwood. So the Roman Empire is going to fall, and it's going to cause a bitterness for the people under them. Now again, as we said, Christians are going to be happy, but some people that will be a bitter thing to see Rome fall. Go to verse 12 now. We got a couple of verses left real quick. Verse 12. Then the fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them were darkened, and a third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. Okay, we've talked about this darkening before, the sky's darkening. And what does the sky's darkening represent? It represents, again, the judgment of God. Haley said in his commentary that throughout the Old Testament, a light from the sun, moon, and stars signifies salvation, well-being, happiness, truth, wisdom, and joy. The fading of the light and the removal of these heavenly bodies symbolizes judgment for God. So if their stars and the sun and the moon are representative of salvation and well-being and happiness, those are darkened. That means instead you're facing judgment. He gives some passages there, Isaiah 13, Joel 3, and Amos 8. So what's the point of the first four trumpets? God is coming in judgment. The people will fall, the nation will fall, the rulers will fall, but he's coming in judgment on Rome. Let's go to verse 13 real quick. And I looked, and I'm reading from the New King James, I looked and I heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the remaining blast of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound. Now, depending on your translation, you have something different. The NU critical text, Nestle Allen United Bible Society, and the majority text used the term eagle, but the Textus Receptus, which the New King James and King James is based off of, uses the term angel. We can't get into all this morning or this evening about which is more accurate from a textual standpoint. There's arguments you can make for both. Let's go from the background standpoint. While angel are mentioned, an eagle seems to fit the message the best. An eagle is used, Hosea 8, Habakkuk 1, and Matthew 24. An eagle symbolizes a sign of disaster. And so here's what Harkwriter said. The solemn triple woe announced by the screeching of the eagle shows that the three trumpets yet to sound are to bring worse plagues than those already delivered. Now, the point, whether it's an angel or an eagle, is the same. But when you take how the eagle is used in the Old Testament, it represents disaster. And so what he's saying is there's disaster coming. In fact, the last three trumpets are worse than the first four. And that's the point that he's making here at the end of chapter 8. Now, Lord willing, on Sunday morning, we'll pick up in chapter 9. We'll see the first two of those final three trumpets and the sounds that they bring on Sunday morning.